Syrian pro-government forces are expected to help Kurdish militia defend the city of Afrin. That's according to Syrian state media. It follows an alleged deal between Damascus and the Kurds. Under the agreement, pro-Assad troops will help Kurdish fighters repel Turkey's offensive in the region. This footage, filmed by our Repli video news agency on Saturday, shows what appears to be the construction of a temporary military base in Afrin. RT's Paul Aslier has more on how Turkey has reacted to the potential alliance between the Syrian government and the Kurdish groups.
In the coming hours, it is widely expected that pro-Damascus government forces will enter the northern Syrian region of Afrin. We're hearing that according to Syrian state TV. Now, there they'll provide assistance to Syrian Kurds who, for the better part of a month, have been trying to repel a Turkish military offensive. This latest development follows a deal that was allegedly sealed on Sunday between Damascus and the Syrian Kurds. Now, the Turkish foreign minister has responded, saying that Ankara has no problem with pro-government forces entering Afrin, but only so long as those forces are there to eliminate Kurdish groups that Turkey considers terrorist groups. If that's not their goal, then certainly Ankara does have a problem.
If regime forces enter the city to eliminate the PKK and PYD terrorists, then we don't have a problem with that. However, if they go there to defend the YPG, then nothing can stop our soldiers.
Now, this part of the region has been embroiled in bitter violence for at least a month, ever since Ankara launched its military operation called Olive Branch against Kurds who it regards as terrorists. Now, this fierce fighting has resulted in multiple casualties as well as civilian deaths on both sides of the conflict. Talking about civilians, those who live in the Afrin region have hailed the potential entrance of pro-Damascus government forces into their area.
As a citizen of Afrin, I do not find fault with the Syrian forces entering some points on the border. As residents of Afrin, we never wanted partition.
There is a duty of the Syrian government to defend its borders and protect Afrin, which is within Syrian borders.
Ankara launched its military operation after the Pentagon announced that it was helping to establish a Kurdish-led security border force along the Turkish-Syrian border. Ankara responded with fury, accusing the United States of essentially setting up what are called a terror army. Since then, the United States has tried to backtrack, but essentially it's too little too late, and the situation on the ground is really beyond the point of being able to change. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who's been following these developments carefully, has said that America's involvement inside Syria has resulted in this bloodshed.
We are concerned about attempts to partition Syria. Some of the plans that the US has already started to realize on the ground are worrying. The US claims that their only goal in Syria is to fight ISIL and to preserve the country's integrity. But I think that Washington needs to back its words with actions, because right now its actions look provocative. The US used the Kurds to pursue its own ambitions, and that's led to a major conflict in Afrin.
Now, tensions on the ground continue to escalate, despite the fact that in the past month, the United States has tried on various occasions to try and de-escalate the situation. What remains now, of course, is to see how this latest development escalates tensions even further.
Well, we're going to discuss this further with military analyst Kamal Alam. Kamal, welcome to the programme. Let's start with what you think this development means for the conflict in the area.
I think it's quite a significant and positive development if it holds through. And it's not completely surprising. The Syrian Kurds had asked the Syrian government for help a week ago, and the Syrian government themselves had said that it's their sovereign territory and it's only their forces that should be operating there and no non-state actors. And if the Syrian military go through and they're back in control of the area, that means Turkey has really no legitimacy to remain in the area, and they'll have to withdraw back to Turkish borders.
So does that mean the Syrian government needs to pick a side in the conflict between Turkey and the Kurdish groups, in your opinion?
It could be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, because as we've seen, the Turkish reaction has been that if the Syrian government goes there and takes over the area and there's no threat to Turkey, Turkey has no problem with that. So Turkey, on paper, are still saying that they support Syrian sovereignty. So Syrian being the government, they have every right to go in there. So it doesn't necessarily mean Turkey will be opposed to this. However, if the Turkish military remains there and comes into direct conflict with the Syrian military, that could be a big issue.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think the consequences are going to be with this alleged deal between Damascus and the Kurds?
I think the consequences are that the US policy of using the Kurds for their own advantage could fall apart, because essentially the Americans have been saying that they are present in northern Syria to help the SDF and the Syrian Kurds fight against the terrorists. But there are no more ISIS in that area, and if the Syrian government moves in, the US have to move out. So the consequences is that the last remaining card that the Americans had in northern Syria falls apart, and if the Turkish government realize that the Syrians have a right to be there, this could be a very positive development. If, however, the Turkish government choose to keep supporting the Syrian rebel groups, then there could be a conflict.
You mentioned there that you say that, you know, it'll come to fruition that Washington, that they'll have to move out. How likely do you think that's going to happen? How is it going to happen?
I mean, at the moment, the Americans have been very adamant they're not going to move out. I mean, Turkey, which is their NATO ally, have also asked them to move out, especially from Manbij, which isn't that far from Afrin. So it really depends, because the Americans were hoping and counting on the Turkish-Syrian governments clashing. If that doesn't happen, that means the US has very little right to be there. So at the moment, it looks unlikely that the US will move out, because they need a reason to be there. So we'll wait to see. It's still very early to make a judgment on what the Americans do next.
You know, if we stick with their support, do you think this new alliance is going to affect Washington's support for the Kurdish groups?
Potentially. We already saw for the last 2 weeks that the Kurdish groups were critical of the Americans, saying that the Americans have abandoned us and we're on our own, because once Turkish military moved in, the Americans were not providing much support to the Kurdish forces. So as far as the Kurds go, they already were feeling let down by the Americans, and that's why they've asked the Syrian government to move in, because a month ago this probably would not have been on the cards. But as the Kurds saw that America has not been a very reliable ally, they've moved back to Damascus, which had an agreement with them that they would help them as long as Syrian sovereignty is not violated and Damascus has the monopoly in terms as being the state.
OK, well, it is a developing situation, as always. Military analyst Kamal Alam, thanks very much for coming onto the programme.